React JSX. In working with arbitrary HTML5 elements, the developers of React created a new language called JavaScript XML, or JSX for an abbreviated form. This is a stricter version of HTML. It looks like normal elements, but it follows the rules of XML and in fact is based on XML. This means, of course, that it then develops three primary rules that it follows. The first of which that all elements must be wrapped, all elements must close, and then finally, as part of being in JavaScript, only JavaScript expressions are allowed. So let's look at each of these rules individually. The first, wrapped elements. This borrows from its basis in XML. Again, JavaScript XML, JSX, is based on XML. In XML, only the root element can stand alone. That is, XML as its own root element can exist, but all other elements must be wrapped. That is, they must be enclosed by other elements. So here's an example of that. If we had a single element, we could use example, but as soon as we introduce more, it would have to be wrapped in other elements. So we have an example of a div, a division HTML element, wrapping another, in this case, component class, example. In other words, we want to use example, but in order to use example, we must wrap it. So this corresponds to the first rule based in XML of JSX. Everything must be wrapped. This folds into the second rule, also part of XML. Everything must close. HTML is a very loose markup language compared to XML. In HTML, they allow for elements like the image tag, for example, that doesn't normally use a closing tag. It doesn't close at all. You can just have the opening tag and HTML understands what you mean. This is not allowed in XML. In XML, all elements must close. What this means is if we were using image, or for the example here, example, with its just opening tag, it must then self-close. All elements must close. This is a rule of XML inherited into JSX. So we then have either opening tag, closing tag for elements, or an opening tag which is also the self-closing tag. Notice in this case the slash at the end of the opening tag if it is self-closing. So in this case it could be, as shown in the previous slide, example, and then with an ending tag slash example, or a self-closing opening tag, in this case example with the slash at the end of the opening tag. Regardless though, and again inherited from XML, all elements must close. It is an error if an element does not close, and JSX will not work correctly and neither will React. So based on both of these, both that elements must be wrapped, again pulled from XML, and all elements must close, again pulled from XML, we move into the third and final rule. Only JavaScript expressions are allowed. Now this may seem a little bit weird, but in order to reduce the overall complexity, JSX does not allow JavaScript keywords like for, while, if, else, let, const, and a large number of other things. The reason for this is it only cares about values. Expressed in a more technical sense in JavaScript, these are called expressions. Expressions is a way of saying that anything that has a value or will produce a value during runtime. So only JavaScript expressions, that is, values, are allowed. In general, this means only variables and functions, which functions are a type of value because they can be stored in a variable, are used. So we can't use JavaScript keywords within JSX. That is, we're writing a kind of HTML. Within that HTML, we can only use values, that is, variables or functions, which again are a type of value, and we can't use other keywords like for, while, let, and a number of other things, which means we can't write conditional statements, which would depend on those keywords within JSX, nor can we write the normal looping structures of for and while within JSX because, again, those keywords are not allowed. So while this may seem strange, this really reduces the overall complexity and focuses in JSX on, again, just expressing either wrapped content, closing tags, or values, or again, in a more technical term, JavaScript expressions. Like template literals, which again is part of JavaScript EX6, expressions are enclosed in opening and closing curly brackets. And I have two examples right here. We see example, and then within that is content for the element example expressed as a variable value. Again, is a JavaScript expression, some value, wrapped in opening and closing curly brackets. I could also, as a second example here, also include a function call because it is a kind of value, and all functions return some value even if it's nothing. So again, generally variables, which of course contain values, or function calls, which again are a kind of value. So open and close curly brackets around either variables or function calls. Now the other thing that needs to be put into this is that every element in React is its own component. Again, React uses the component model, so all elements are technically components. Because it is based in JavaScript, each element is also an object. Again, because JavaScript is based on an object-oriented programming model. So everything is an object, and in React, everything is a component, all elements that is. So all elements are themselves both components and objects based on the language and the model that React uses. So that means example here, again with the self-closing tag, becomes an object based on class example. So that means that we have objects that are equivalent to elements within React based on how JSX and the component models work together. So as a review, in the component model, we break up pages into components, into their parts, which are based on arbitrary HTML because it's allowed in HTML5. Moving into JSX then, we start to think about HTML as a stricter form of XML, or a stricter form of HTML expressed as XML, called JSX, again, JavaScript XML. So in which case then we start to think about combining both the component model and JSX as elements that are components and components that are objects, building these ideas layer by layer. Everything is an object. We start writing things as elements based in JSX, and this is based on the fact that these are all components. So moving ahead then, we see to help with this, React adds a class called component. This allows us to define new classes, again, blueprints for future objects that can be based on React.component or just component as a class. And so then we can write our own objects. In this case, example extends React.component, again, extending the existing class component to create an object that then in the future could be expressed as an element within JSX. Because in React, the component model and JSX work together. So let's review everything I've talked about here. JavaScript XML, JSX, is a more stricter form of XML based, a stricter form of HTML based on XML. Because it inherits from XML, it has two rules that draw directly from that language. The first of which is that all elements must be wrapped. This pulls from XML because only the root element itself can stand alone. Everything else must be expressed within parent-child relationships. So everything must be wrapped, in other words. Secondly, JSX rule is that all elements must close. Again, this pulls from XML itself. In HTML, we have the ability to have opening tags without closing tags. This is not allowed in XML. In XML, everything must close, so then if we want, can express something as an opening tag and closing tag, or an opening tag with the close within that, and otherwise known as a self-closing tag. So all elements must close. The third rule of JSX is that only JavaScript expressions are allowed. This is a more technical way of saying that only values are allowed. That is, we're using variables or we're using function calls, because both of which can be expressed as values within JavaScript. Again, remembering that a function is a kind of value. Finally, then, we start to combine the component model with JSX by building all of these concepts together. In JavaScript, everything is expressed as an object, layer 1. Moving up then, one step of complexity, we start to look at the component model in which pages are broken up into components. In React, all components then are based on objects. So we've moved from JavaScript's expression of objects to a level of abstraction where React is looking at components which are based on objects. Finally, we move into using JSX, which is itself uses elements based on XML. But React understands that all elements are components and all components are objects, starting then at the highest level of abstraction and moving back down into JavaScript. Again, starting with JavaScript using objects, components being those objects, and finally that we express components as elements. So elements are components, components are objects. Moving up and down the layers of abstraction, combining JavaScript's idea of objects with the component model, and then finally combining all of this with JSX and its 3 rules of elements must be wrapped, elements must close, and only JavaScript expressions are allowed. A whole lot of terms here, but very principles upon which React works. Again, combining the component model with JSX and its 3 rules.